What are tankies? I don't know. Going in, let me tell you what I think they are, because I hear this term all the time, but I only get it in the context of people throwing accusations at each other. And I've never heard somebody be a self-proclaimed tanky. Maybe such a thing exists, but I haven't heard it, which means it's hard to really understand it unless you do a deep dive. Well, somebody did a deep dive. And rather than me do the work, let's have them do the work. Let's watch it on Peace Talks together. Find out what a tanky is. But I'll tell you what I think they are going in, and we can see how accurate it is. My understanding is a tanky refers to somebody that likes the idea of communism, but doesn't really understand what it is, and also thinks that Soviets were communists, not understanding that they were communists in the same way that the Nazis were National Socialists, where they've just taken the word without the actual practices, and their version of that thing they said they were is quite actually dark and a bad representative. So that, the reason they're called tankies, whenever anything has a Russian aesthetic or the backings of the ex-Soviets, the Russians, they say, send in the tanks. Go get them. I'm supporting them. I don't think that's right. Let's find out. It's what I think it is, but I think I'm wrong, in other words.
Come join us over on The Deprogram, a podcast I run with Second Thought and Yugopnik.
To quote our favorite authoritarian GT, have these gentlemen ever seen these nuts?
Intro topics, history, memes, and me being perpetually tired. All of it is at your disposal. A recent episode titled Tanky Discourse. Go check it out. Alright, let's get into it. Tanky is a term you hear thrown around a lot, but it seemingly doesn't have any meaning. The quick summary is, it doesn't really. Well, it kinda does, but the intention behind its use is generally nebulous, and the term is expanded so much as to be meaningless.
Okay. So I instantly feel better. I feel better for not really understanding what it means. All right, good. But let's find out what it's supposed to mean then.
The origins of the term. Originally, tanky was a term that originated in the British left wing for those that supported the Soviet intervention in Hungary. The intervention is a huge topic in and of itself, so take a look at the history of the working class movement in Hungary for a deeper dive. TLDR, it's far more complicated than libertarian socialist uprising or complete fascist takeover. Regardless, neither that Hungarian Republic nor the USSR are with us today, so why is the term still used? What people mean. Nowadays, the term tanky is mostly used by people, some which claiming to be leftist while others clearly not, to refer derogatorily to... Well, here's where it gets a little more complicated. There are a few targets. Number 1, in the narrowest possible definition, tankies are those that are more or less partial to the experiences and lessons of former socialist as well as current socialist examples, as well as their leaders, for example the USSR, Cuba, Vietnam, etc. Number 2, slightly broader, a tanky is anyone who defends or more commonly simply clarifies misconceptions around former socialisms. A tanky also usually presents a nuanced understanding of why certain actions were taken, which some interpret as running defense for some.
I don't want to insist upon ignorance, but one of my favorite things is to demand somebody be sent to the gulag. I just think it is a very funny thing to say. So I will probably, unless this video does a hell of a good job of telling me why I shouldn't, I probably will demand people get sent to the gulag. Not even fully grasping the historicity of that. Flawed presenter, folks, but at least I let you know well in advance.
Things supposedly inexcusable. Number 3, broader still, as a catch-all term for Marxist-Leninists and adjacent ideologies, which usually encapsulate support for the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat, democratic centralism, the active suppression of the bourgeoisie, a more involved approach towards internal security, economic planning, etc. This also usually...
Am I a tanky? I might be a little tanky.
Follows the condemnation of the use of force in times when it was possible that it was warranted. This links well with the general link with authoritarianism, which we'll touch on soon. Anti-imperialism, and by extension anti-Americanism too, fits here, so I'll mention it. Number 4, much more commonly, tanky is a lazy term used to demonize people to the left of the one using the term. generally intended to dismiss and ostracize said people without engaging or offering a counterargument. This particular usage case is most common with liberals who adopt a radical lib approach without any theoretically derived radical content besides engagement in electoral politics and an allegiance to American exceptionalism. A derived term, although even more nebulous, is red fascist, usually just shortened to red fash, but we're not going to touch on that today. And number 5, finally, the caricature. A person that doesn't exist with opinions that no one really holds, but it's used for soy Wojak memes, as the internet usually does. It's supposed to mean someone who uncritically supports everything a socialist nation does. These people don't exist. The USSR or China or Stalin did nothing wrong is a meme said online as a joke. No one actually believes it. Like,
A lot of folks. Let me give you the guy whose videos I just demand be out of my circulation because I have no patience for him. Hassan Abi. Dude had a hammer and sickle as a flag proudly hanging up behind him. Why? Because he didn't know the difference between Soviets and the concept of communism, and he was only paying an aesthetic tribute to these things, not realizing that for a lot of folks, that's like having a swastika hanging up proudly while you're saying, I'm a socialist, see? And you could have known that about him well in advance, just looking at it. And surprise, surprise, when Russia invaded Ukraine, what did he do? Hassan Abi or Hassan Piker. Where am I getting Abi from? Anyway, Hassan Piker frickin' came down, my understanding is, on the side of the Ruskies. And it's because he is that guy. I'm sorry. I know this person is the person educating me, but I must disagree here. There are folks that think that are that shallow about it. And they're a real danger because you can be shallow and charismatic, which Hassan Piker is, and that gets folks killed. It gets people killed. So to that point, sir, I respectfully disagree. I don't think there is nobody like that. However, I do suspect that 999 out of 1,000 times that accusation is leveled, it's an exaggeration.
Likewise, seeing someone saying something on Twitter and interpreting that opinion as representative of the entire movement is silly. In my personal experience, you won't ever see a more critical and nuanced view of, for example, the USSR, than from someone who has actually taken the effort to properly study that system, usually a well-read Marxist-Leninist. We have a dedicated episode on that topic here. What's the point? More or less, it's a commonality of politics to invent derogatory terms for those that you disagree with. This example is no different. In almost all use cases I've seen, it's used exclusively online by mostly radlibs and other quasi-liberal types to dismiss an argument or person without engaging with the content itself. I remember anarchists, ANCOMs, and the like using it plenty before, but that usage has died down over the past several years, from what I've seen. Regardless, a good point to note is that if we're using the term against people who recognize the achievements of former socialisms and adhere to more or less orthodox theoretical approaches to socialism, meaning Marxist-Leninist ones, then this term is a little more than, hopefully, an unintentional condemnation of third world or imperial periphery leftists. The vast majority, dare I say all actually influential Marxist thinkers of the 20th century, fit the tanky label if applied uniformly. Even more so when looking at post-independence, anti-colonial, and anti-imperialist, read Black and Brown, figures. The vast majority of active leftists globally, the ones agitating for socialism, are people who identify with Marxism and Leninism or an adjacent offshoot, who recognize and respect the lessons of former socialist experiments, are usually part of Marxist-Leninist parties, and uphold figures that symbolize the revolutionary socialist movement. In essence, the vast majority of the global left would be tanky in that case. What does that say about the so-called non-tanky Western left, though? Isn't it at least a little infantilizing and Eurocentric to consider that only the West has it right, meanwhile the vast majority of historic as well as modern revolutionary leftists had it entirely wrong? Likewise, the term seems to apply selectively. Those with incredibly similar beliefs and approaches may get the label on them, or not, usually based on the level of demonization in common anti-communist American media, or based on how much that particular individual likes said figure. Concretely, Sankara and Castro aren't too different from Kim Il-sung or Honecker. On authority. Another point usually tied in.
This is likely the last section we're going to watch. And I'll tell you why if it ends up being that. Because it sounds like it's a dying term, and why take the time to study it if it's going to go away anyway? I just wanted to know because I've seen it recently a couple of times. Might have just been some old heads that like still say groovy, like me.
Into tanky discourse is the idea of authority or authoritarianism. Before getting into it, the term is also incredibly nebulous. Between dictionaries and various quote-unquote respectable encyclopedias, you get several incredibly broad or contradictory definitions. As with totalitarianism, it's more of an invented political term used in attempts by particularly American academia to lump fascism with socialism. This is further strengthened by the fact that the same yardstick can parallel, for example, the US very well, or even better than the intended nation that label is being placed upon, yet it's rarely done. Typical government versus regime language in an attempt to more subtly shape what you think. For the liberals in the crowd, name something you dislike about authoritarian socialist governments, and a government model you look up to or believe is viable to reform has most likely done the same at some point to differing extents. I would actually say the prime liberal democratic example, the United States, has done far worse on almost every account, but they're always spared the term or the criticism. A fairly decent read I'd recommend on this topic is Human Rights in the Soviet Union by Albert Szymanski. Likewise, to anarchist listeners, every prior example anarchists uphold had exclusive access to and use of arms, had labor discipline, an internal security apparatus, a system of prisons which included political prisoners, a hierarchical bureaucracy, exclusive control of sources of media, conscription, I could go on. It seems the only successful socialist attempts at building something tangible gets this authoritarian label thrown on it, likewise with this tanky business. The anarchist examples were commendable, but in the end failed fairly early on and in a way that spares them that criticism. My point is, the methods before, during, and after a revolution will always be categorized according to authoritarian means, and hence pretending that revolution, the violent overthrow of one class by another, and the forceful establishment of some form of proletarian rule, be it a state or democratic federated workers' councils, as not authoritarian is just silly. If your issue is less the means and more with the degree of community control, well, this is a question of theory.
Yeah. I think that's enough. So in summation, what is a tanky? Nebulous term. It's a way to rag on somebody that is you're acknowledging at least is on the left, but you think is not on the left the right way. Okay. It seems like in terms of how it's actually used, that's what it comes down to. Cool. Question answered. Useless term. Vosh uses it a lot, or at least used to use it a lot. I haven't heard him use it lately. It would appear that's why it doesn't really mean anything anymore. What does it mean overall? What can we learn from this, generally speaking? Be critical of catchphrases you hear. If somebody cannot explain what they are saying in simple, understandable terms, it's probably because they are either unable to explain it at all, they're unable to understand it themselves, or they're nervous about being honest about what it really is. This includes, by the way, for overly academic terms. If somebody is only ever rattling off a series of academic terms, even if they're using the terms correctly, which they rarely are, but even if they are using them correctly, that's just another grift. It's because they want you to believe that they know what they're talking about, but they don't want you to know what they're talking about. And that's a problem. So if you see somebody calling somebody else a tanky, ask them to rephrase. That's what I would recommend. And the reason is not to get people to stop criticizing the left from the left. It is to get them to criticize the left well. Because criticism, believe it or not, I believe, I should say, but believe it or not, I am convinced that criticism on the left is a strength. And I think that Reagan's 11th commandment really was a big part of what destroyed the U.S. Conservative movement. Their inability to criticize each other, the taboo of doing that, turned them into MAGA. And I do believe it's time for some drastic, far-left reform in the United States. And if we're going to be doing that, well, damn it, we better do it right. So criticize, but criticize well. And if somebody calls somebody else a tanky, ask them to use a term that has a common understanding, because this one doesn't. Let's see what you all have to say.